I am very excited because I have with me Curt Doolittle, founder of the Propertarian Institute, and in my opinion, the most important intellectual alive today. And this is a series of videos where we are going through a second American Constitution, an updated American Constitution. We could call it different things. We could call it a Propertarian Constitution, a Constitution for America 2.0, but it puts in practice the insights of propertarianism, which writes down the success strategy of America and Western civilization in scientific and legal language. And it completes the Founding Fathers' vision by putting into practice knowledge we've accumulated over the past decades and even over the last couple of centuries about what to do and what not to do when it comes to rule of law and government. And it undoes a lot of the mistakes that we've made that have led to the myriad of problems that we have today. Not only that, but it provides a solution for the crisis in America and lays a solid foundation for life in America after we come out of this crisis so that our descendants don't have to go through this whole mess again. And as you've heard me say on other videos, if we implement this Constitution, I believe we and our descendants will have a higher quality of life than any group of people in the history of the world have ever experienced. So just a couple of quick pieces of information before I bring Curt in. You can read this Constitution on propertarianism.com, and I will also put a link to it in the description of this video and in the top comment. And I would just say from my personal experience, Curt Doolittle is extremely well read on all the pertinent issues and the books and the research papers around every topic that is included in this Constitution. So I would say give Curt the benefit of the doubt a little bit if you find something or hear something you don't quite understand or that's a little bit outside the box of your current understanding, because Curt thinks through things extremely thoroughly, and there's a very good reason for everything that you will find in this Constitution. So Curt, welcome. Thank you so much for the immense time and effort that you have put into crafting this Constitution. And do you have any initial thoughts that you'd like to share?
I think that, first of all, I want to thank you for the introduction. I always feel undeserved. Thank you.
You're not. I believe you deserve it, and I really appreciate. I really appreciate. I know it's a lot of hard work, Curt, and I don't know if people realize how much hard work you do, but I, for one, definitely appreciate it. I know there's many others that do.
If I had known what this would take, I never would have done it. That's for sure.
So let's go now to this part of the conversation where Curt and I are going through and touching on some of the key policies in this updated American Constitution, and you're going to see how these policies are really going to improve your life and our lives directly in a very tangible way. And the first topic we're going to talk about, which is fixing the money system, that's going to benefit everybody, no matter where they are on the political spectrum. The only people that are really going to lose there are bankers and some other elite parasitic types. So let's go into the conversation here.
Most of what I do in policy is to separate the commercial investment, commercial finance investment banking, and consumer. So if you're a consumer, you're taking a zero credit loan out of the Treasury for whatever you can afford to. And when there's liquidity need, in other words, you probably don't, if people don't understand this, if they need to put money into the economy, they don't put it into the banking system, they put it into you.
Yes. Another way to explain it is instead of bankers bringing money into existence in the form of a loan and charging people interest on it, charging you interest on it, the Treasury is cutting the bankers out of the equation. They're the ones that are putting money into the economy, bringing money into existence, and it's being distributed. Instead of going to banks who then lend it to you, it's going just to you, and the middleman bankers are cut out of it, and it reduces a massive amount of the debt slavery and debt problem that people have. Was that a pretty good description?
Think of it as nationalizing consumer credit. It means your house is going to be paid for in 8 years.
Yes,
right?
Instead of 30. Yeah.
It means it means the college, your university has to carry the loan.
Yes, this is another fantastic one I wanted to make sure to highlight is this would absolutely gut the leftist control of the universities. So not only would student loans only be given and state funding only be provided for STEM plus law, none of this other pseudoscience garbage, but also the university itself would have to be the one who takes out the loan, and then they have to pay it back to the Treasury by getting payroll deduction from the student after they graduate. So in other words, universities cannot make a profit off of garbage degrees anymore. This would totally gut.
And also if you're out before the second year, they have to eat the loan.
Yes.
You're going to see what happens to how colleges behave if you make those two changes.
Changes the incentives completely.
Now you can be a professor. If you say something that's false or irreciprocal, it's criminal.
Yes.
Now what happens? So now you've got universities stop being leftist theological institutions, and they're only able to say truthful and reciprocal things.
That's right. And just in case there is any audience that has not been exposed to my previous videos or Curt's writings on this, when we're talking about being able to prosecute false or irreciprocal behavior, the false part of that is not somebody willy-nilly deciding somewhere what's false and what's true. It's people who speak in public have to ensure that their statements pass several empirical falsehood tests. They don't have to prove everything they're saying is 100% true, because that's difficult, but they have to pass the test.
You just say, I'm not saying anything false or irreciprocal. In other words, that really isn't that difficult, but you also have to realize that loser pays. So you can't go sue your professor for saying something unless you want to get triple damages.
Yes, because if you take the suit to court and you lose, then you're going to be paying.
You're going to be paying.
Yeah, so it's not abused. Yep.
We get rid of all this, I can get away with it.
Yes.
So there's two things we're getting. So a second thing with the Treasury is we're getting rid of what's called rent seeking. What it means is profiting without contributing to production.
Yes.
So what this will do is I'm trying to force investment community into longer term returns instead of short term returns. And I'm trying to force investment into investment returns rather than parasitism upon our people. So if we deprive the investment community of the ability to seek mortgage rents, right? Car payment rents. If those things are essentially whatever you can pay them. And moreover, the government is handing out money that goes against that account whenever the economy is getting harsh, so your life gets easier.
All right, John, Mark jumping in here quickly to clarify, Curt is not talking about taking money from you and giving it to somebody else. What he's talking about is money coming into existence and going directly into the economy rather than going to bankers who then lend it into the economy. So it's removing this massive debt slavery aspect we have right now that is totally unnecessary. And if this is brand new to you, you need to realize there are millions and millions of people on the grassroots right that understand that this needs to be fixed. And this has been understood for a while. There were people that understood this very, very clearly and tried to warn America about it. There were congressmen that tried to warn America about it in 1913 when the Federal Reserve Act came into being. This is a battle that has waged actually throughout American history at different times. There were presidents who fought the bankers. Andrew Jackson fought the bankers. Thomas Jefferson warned us against bankers. And they were basically all saying the same thing. Don't give your economy over to bankers. In other words, don't let bankers be the ones who bring money into existence and print the currency. And that's what we allowed in 1913. And so really, when we're fixing this, we're following the advice of the Thomas Jeffersons and the Andrew Jacksons and all the people throughout our history and the millions of people today that know that we need to change this system because it is inherently parasitic. So if this is new to you, just understand that there are many millions of people on the grassroots right today, and there were many, many people throughout American history, including presidents, founding fathers, etc., that understood the basics of this issue, and this updated American Constitution here fixes that problem and makes it so that it can never be a problem again.
A couple of things are going to really interesting things happens to the investment community. They have to go put their money in things that have less certain and therefore longer returns. And it sort of solves the problem of absorbing so much free capital that's out there right now. I don't want to.
That's interesting though. So it's adjusting the incentives so that there's better investment, and so that we don't have this dynamic where it's not producing anything for the economy. They're just collecting money off of nothing.
And then they bait people into debt, and then they have debt collectors appropriate from people.
Yes.
So let's destroy that whole root economy.
And this will have it's hard to describe to people what a massively positive impact this will have on the economy.
Well, you'll be able to run a household on one income.
Yes. Yep. A lot of this financial pressure that people feel is artificially created by this dynamic that Curt is talking about here, and is eliminated by this.
Well, a lot of the economic stuff is frankly way too technical for the audience. And what happens is if I do it at a level that's short, some idiots will come up and tell me I'm wrong, and they'll make a video.
Yes. So we don't have to go into,
we have to say, just, I'll cover it later.
Yeah. But I think the audience can get the point here, Curt, that this is going to make everybody's life dramatically easier. And just to mention, there's a couple of videos, like there's one called The Money Masters. There's a video series that's great to watch. It might be on YouTube. Just if this is brand new to you, it kind of helps you understand some of the background.
You are being screwed every day by that. Everything you think about the financial and political sector, you can't put it into words like you can't put morality or Western civilization or conservatism or traditionalism into words, but you know it, right? Well, the same thing is with everything wrong with our society. When I talk about pseudoscience and numeracy, if I explain to you what's been done to you, you'll start hanging people tomorrow.
Yeah. Yep. But it's great that you understand it, Curt. You understand it well enough to write down how to fix it.
Yeah, they're going to kill me for it.
Well, hopefully that doesn't happen, Curt. I know you're just being funny, but it is. I mean, let's not gloss over this. This is dangerous to a lot of people who are making a lot of money by being parasites, but it is within our power to end it.
Trillions, every year. Trillions. If people talk about, I want to take $100 million from Bill Gates. I mean, you're a freaking idiot. Do you know where trillions is going? Trillions. $100 billion means each of us gets like 3. In the end, or 30 rather.
Yeah, just take it from Bill Gates and hand it out. I mean, that's nothing.
That guy does more good with his $100 billion, right? Every day of his life than the entire government would ever do in a year.
And that's why this is so powerful is, see, the left kind of capitalizes on a lot of this financial stress that people experience, and they say, well, we're just going to take money from the billionaires and give it to you. But as Curt is pointing out, that's really not a solution. It wouldn't really actually do that much. What we're talking about here would have a tremendous, tremendous positive impact on everybody that's not like a banker or an elite scumbag.
So let's talk about those two things. If we took all that dead capital we call Washington, D.C., and we reallocated it to different cities in different states. In other words, if everybody wasn't trying to compete for control of the federal dollars, but instead we had a lot of states working locally, and people had their education problem changed, their financial problem was changed. If those two things happened, what would happen to be the greatest reallocation of capital since the Romans had their restructuring.
Wow.
So it's, when you brought up earlier, it's going to change. No, people have no idea. This is like the church had 50% of Europe's capital dead
in the Middle Ages.
Right. And so what could we do? I mean, what do you think they had to reclose the monasteries for? And so we get the capital back in motion. And so look what happened. Well, it's the same thing now, is that we have a lot of dead capital. All the money in the country is around Washington. It's around New York City where they print the money. And it's around L.A. where they print the propaganda. Well, if you make it so you can't propaganda lie anymore, there's no money to be made in usury, except other than investment, and that the government's been devolved for the states, that capital is reallocated.
Yes.
We can start generating human capital again. Now, people don't think of it this way, but children are human capital. I mean, they're a kind of capital, a kind of production, and they're expensive. And if you suck all the money out of middle-class families.
Yes. So to just give a quick example, imagine if the payments you had to make for your mortgage and your car were cut in half or just drastically reduced from what they are now. Imagine you could spend that on your kids, on having kids. People would feel like they could afford kids, and people would feel like they could afford having a one-income home and the mother staying home with the kids. And there would be more spending money to spend on other things instead of just sending it to bankers who are just sitting there really producing nothing.
Well, most of the big cities are bankrupt, right? So if we make those their own city states, They can run there's crazy little programs as long as they want, but they can't take the rest of the people down with them.
Yes, if they want to do that. And that's one of the things you have in the Constitution as well, and I don't want to get off track, but where a lot of these cities that are just crazy leftist cities that want to do this stuff, they basically become city-states and they can't impose their will on the rest of the country.
They have no power outside of their borders.
Yes, which is fantastic.
And that's what we want, right? I mean, that's the vehicle. The vehicle by which we've been undermined is actually immigration. We would have won. We won nature versus nurture. We won gender differences. And right now we're winning racial differences. And we're certainly going to win IQ and class differences.
You're talking about scientifically, the science that's coming out is completely destroying the left on all of this.
So the only reason they have anything is because they promised us they wouldn't use the 65 Immigration Act to do this, and they did.
Yep.
Well, under propertarian law and under the Constitution, you're liable for that. We're coming after you.
And what Curt's talking about here, if there's any audience that is new, is that immigrants, non-whites, vote more than 2-to-1 left. And so it's not that they have won. It's not that the left is winning the argument or winning over the historical European peoples, because most white people vote right wing. It's that they're just importing voters. And under propertarian law, they are liable for that because that is imposing a cost, and it's allowing them to put lies into the public and all of this, which can also be prosecuted. So,
the Jews used a great tactic after the war, which is to go after and recollect from the Nazis. What do you think we're going to do after this civil war? We're to go recollect from those leftists.
Yes. Restitution.
Right. Yeah. So that's what we're scared about.
That is great. I mean, this is why I say, folks, you guys know me. I'm pretty good at marketing and getting the word out and creating catchy phrases and stuff like that. But I am not exaggerating when I say I get so excited reading this and talking about this and seeing what's in this Constitution, because this is what needs to happen. This is the restoration of the Western way, the Western success strategy, and our enemies will not be able to get away with what they used to be able to get away with because we have such a solid foundation here. So,
Curt, a moral license.
Yes.
It's a moral license, a set of demands, a means of insurrection or demands, and a means of transition. So it's what I set out to produce. And, you're not going to figure it out in 5 minutes in a comic book, although I bet one of our guys will eventually.
People get pretty good at it, yes.
But yes. In all seriousness, I put a lot of work into this. It will work. The real problem for Western man is, what are we? Because we do it by tradition. We didn't have our Bible written down, so to speak.
Yes, we did it by instinct.
Right, we do it by tradition, instinct, inheritance. We don't have the white law, right? Yep. Like the Quran, right? But now we do.
Yes, this is it. I was just going to go through a quick list of a couple of the policies that I think people would like that we didn't touch on. And then you can comment if you want, but I think that people would like to hear this because this is more of the stuff that's really going to directly affect them. We talked about the financial aspect, really fixing that. And we talked about how norms and social policy and how the government is structured is really going to be at the state level. And we're not going to have this big, huge federal government bureaucracy that's going to make people very happy. And then just some simple stuff. No one from outside has the right of refuge, asylum, or immigration.
No.
Fixing the immigration issue.
The natural law, they can't have any right.
Yes. Voting, what you call in the Constitution peerage, I believe, is limited to, everybody doesn't get a vote. It's limited to certain types of people who are much less likely to want to be parasites, we'll put it that way.
You have to demonstrate competence before you can influence others.
Yes.
Because all politics is violence, force. So if you can't demonstrate that you're worthy of it, then why should we give you any influence? I mean, if you're protected under natural law and you're given all these benefits and you're not able to demonstrate that you have ability to contribute instead, then why should you have opinions?
Yes. Why should you have a say over somebody else? Mm-hmm. And just to remind the audience, the Founding Fathers and the original Constitution did not give everyone the right to vote. And that was one of the big mistakes is full franchise.
It's one of the big errors, right? I mean, there's only a couple of catastrophic errors, both in the Roman period and and in the modern, and it's that we gave the franchise. The Romans said it. We screwed this up. I mean, they said it. I mean, and we knew it too. I know why we did it, but we shouldn't have.
Yeah, let's stop making the same mistakes.
Right. I mean, you either, if you earn it, you value it.
Yep.
There's no incentive to conform without it.
Yep. That's great. No more welfare state. If you get any kind of benefits, you don't get it without working, if I remember correctly from the Constitution, Curt.
Yeah, it's a nice way of doing things, but I mean, you have to see the other things I've put in there, which is, I mean, an awful lot of people are redirected to creating an aesthetic commons because there's there's going to be an increasingly large supply of surplus labor. Mm. But I mean, if we turn a lot of people into gardeners, basically. I'm exaggerating, but you can have an awful beautiful commons.
But they're doing something of value. They're not just sitting around collecting welfare checks.
Yeah, you have to contribute.
And it's an important point because you don't have to have, I mean, every state can choose how they want to do it, but you don't have to have like this completely heartless place if you don't want to. You can have some help for people, you can provide some work for people, but you're not going to have this welfare state as we know it today. Well,
I mean, I say stuff prosecutorially, but I mean, if you disagree with what I'm putting out here, you can't be a good person. You can't. I mean, how can you possibly want anything otherwise except to punish people because of genetic envy?
Yeah, because this is so in line with the empirical definition of morality, which is reciprocity. There are ways to, it's an important point, there are ways to help people out within the bounds of reciprocity. You don't have to just leave them to die in the street. That's what I love about this, going back to what we talked about earlier, is every citizen, every resident, even every person has recourse in court to stop any violation of reciprocity. It's not like you have to sit there and put up with it.
You can sell a judge. I mean, you better be right because you're going to pay for it if you don't. But I mean,
that's great.
Nobody gets a free ride.
Yes. Another couple of policies here that I thought would interest people. You have one where the speech or the social platforms, obviously we would think of Facebook, Google, YouTube, Twitter, above a certain size, they become what you call commons, and they're subject to reciprocity, and all the data belongs to the user who created that data. So it eliminates this problem of censorship and allowing lying but not allowing truth tellers and that kind of thing.
I wrote a propositional court piece for class action against the each social media company, Facebook being the one I actually showed people. And, there's absolutely no reason why you and I have interests on Facebook, why we couldn't have political affiliations or political disinterests, and that stuff would never reach us.
Oh, so you're saying a person could say, I don't want to see this or I don't want to see that, and that's fine.
Right. And the point is that the only reason Facebook doesn't do the right thing is because they want to do the wrong thing.
Yes.
Right? So it's an easy problem to fix. There's no reason they can't have every kind of political discourse on there, and people just choose opt in or out based on their affiliations. And they know that stuff anyway. In other words, they know within 100 clicks, they can profile you so deeply it's offensive to you.
So I see what you're saying. So Facebook could create a structure to where if an individual doesn't want to have certain content reach their eyes, they can set that up, that type of thing.
Yeah, or an advertiser. I mean, there's no reason you can't have that in there except that they intentionally want to use it to cause harm. Yes. So in any event, the new version I have is much less kind than what you're reading.
But takes care of that problem, which many right-wingers are very pertinent, very aware of.
You can't argue that Facebook and Google and YouTube, or maybe even Twitter, are not the same thing as a telephone station.
They're public service, yeah.
They're public services now. And I'm sorry, they may not want that to be, but it is. And, and if they're not, then we can nationalize the code and make one ourselves.
Yep. That's great. Another couple ones you have in here as far as policies: marriages between a man and a woman. No more child support or alimony, which means that the vast majority of divorces are initiated by women. So in the current system, women can just divorce on almost any kind of a whim and they get cash and prizes. That will not be the case anymore. Prenuptials cannot be violated.
If you do prenups and that, what will happen is women will be way more careful about getting married.
Yes.
Right? and men will be less terrified of getting married.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
Because right now, if you're a guy and you live in this country, the United States, hell, any Western European country, especially if you have any assets, you're stupid to get married. Absolutely stupid.
Because the whole legal system is rigged against you if the woman wants to.
I mean, I can't tell you what my marriage cost me. And you look at a guy like Bezos, right? I mean, that's just nuts.
Yes.
I mean,
she's getting billions and billions just
that's
from
complete nonsense.
And she didn't really do anything.
I mean, because a man's investment equity. I mean, I had the same problem in my corporations. I mean, why does my wife have it? I mean, I've actually built it into the later shareholder agreements that if you get divorced, it all go back to the company.
Interesting.
Right? Get reissued to you after your divorce.
Yes. So that's a great one. Another one here, tax discount for every child up to the age of 16. So it helps people out who want to have children. And we already talked about the universities and the college system. And then the last one I wanted to mention here is just the foreign policy and the treaties aspect, exiting the United Nations, no treaties that violate the Constitution. With Mexico, we're going to build a wall, repatriate the illegal immigrants, etc. So I think a lot of people are going to really like that aspect of it as well.
I actually say it differently today, is if you can't contain your people, you've surrendered your sovereignty. In other words, we're happy to, if you can't contain you, we're going to rule you and contain them.
Yes, it's basically an act of war if you can't contain your people and they're coming over here.
That's reciprocity, and if you can't contain your people, you just gave us license to fly in the bombers.
And do whatever it takes to protect our people and our nation from any imposition of costs. What you're about to see is a little bit later in the recording, and we're kind of referring back to when we were earlier in the recording talking about the prosecution and the first part before the Constitution itself, which is really laid out like a court case. So we're going to refer briefly to that just so you understand what's going on when we talk about that, and you will get to see that in video number 3 and video number 4 that I'm going to put out shortly after this one. But just understand that that's what we're referring back to. And then in this section, we're going into how the Constitution itself is laid out.
All right. The last part is the actual Constitution. So what we've talked about is all the stuff before it. We've talked about the context of it, the problems we're trying to solve, the differences of it, but then we get down to the actual table of contents.
Yes.
And the Constitution, which consists of this table of contents, is meant to be standalone. So all the stuff that went into the case, I meant that is one document, and the Constitution to be standalone. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. So the Constitution can be standalone. The other is a foundation for the Constitution.
It's just like the Federalist Papers. If you want to know why something's there, that's where it is. But,
that makes sense.
Not everybody needs to read 800 pages of stuff.
It provides additional context and reasoning and detail. Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
So the first part's the introduction. It's a summary of the case. There's a Declaration of Independence, or exact declaration. It's not of independence, but a declaration, which is structured very similarly out of respect for the original declaration. And it basically is a list of the crimes.
Okay. Makes sense.
All right. The preamble is the next piece, and that shows how this Constitution modifies the existing Constitution. And there's a really important reason for doing that. And that's that the United States is what's called a going concern. And so you actually don't want to have the state, which is it's literally like an international corporation. It's just a huge one.
Yes.
You don't want to have it cease being a going concern, because that creates all sorts of financial, political, monetary chaos around the world. So, for example, China owes us trillions of dollars from when it was communist China. Though they don't want to pay us because they say, well, it's a new government, we're a new corporation. Yeah.
That makes sense. So we're not just starting this from scratch. We're taking into account the fact that this is a going concern.
Right. It's just the idea is that it produces a going concern. Now, in that preamble, it's an article by article, whether this replaces, modifies, or is now unnecessary.
Yes.
Right. And so that's what it does. And it's meant to do that so that you can see we are maintaining the United States as a going concern, and that these are just a set of amendments that are passed that revoke certain amendments and implement new amendments.
That makes a lot of sense. And if you read that portion, you'll see basically a list. You'll see a list of the amendments, and this one we're keeping, or this one we're revoking and replacing it, etc. It's very clear when you look at it.
Okay. Now, there's something really interesting. The first three articles are man, the law, and rights and obligations. And you notice they're before anything about government.
Very important point. Law is the most important. Law is prior to government, yes.
So the first article is called man. You know all the stuff that they do in our law where they mess with definitions, and the left is great at this, is that they pretend that the Constitution is a living document rather than a freaking accounting system where changes to it are supposed to be processed in a very orderly fashion, producing transactions. Right?
Yes. So you have a lot of definitions to prevent that sort of thing from happening.
So that section will drive you nuts if you try to
But it's absolutely necessary.
What a woman is, what moral is, it defines everything. And so it defines the nature of man so that we can't pretend that the nature of man isn't as scientifically demonstrated.
My note that I wrote down on that article, Curt, was it's really an empirical observation of how human beings operate as individuals and as groups. And so it might seem like it's not important, but you said it is so important precisely because the left tries to pretend that things are so different than they actually are.
For the programmers out there, you have constants.
I'm sure the programmers will like that one.
There's data types, right? There's a constant. Something can only have these three values, or there's a type. Something can only have these three values, right? That's what it does. It makes it so that when you're using words in the law, they have concrete meaning. If you study the law today, it's a little bit like studying poetry. Well, American contract law at present is really close to programming, which any decent lawyer will tell you. It retains a lot of archaic prose, and it requires a lot of bad behavior that this eliminates. The definitions eliminate.
Very important to have clear, specific definitions.
Okay. So I can't tell you just how important those definitions are to the law. That is half of the problem. If you can't lie about man, it's very hard to make a law that's irreciprocal. Right?
Very important.
All right. So the second article is the law, which is what it is and how to write it. In other words, same thing. What does law mean? What are the different kinds? You probably don't know this, but there's a debate about what law means. There are basically four rough theories of jurisprudence. This is the strict one. This is probably the strictest. I would actually say this is a new one. It's so strict, and because at one end you have people like us who say law is just tort. It's just tort, and the left says law is political. It's whatever we can get away with.
And can you explain the word tort, Curt, for the audience?
Tort. The word tort comes from trespass. And so that's what trespass. I can't trespass against you, your goods, your home, your property, your wife.
Any form of property.
Any form of property. And property in propertarianism is extraordinarily well articulated. So basically it says, when libertarians call it the non-aggression, very poorly, or we call it the law of tort, or as Aristotle would call it, the natural law.
Yes. It's a very specific definitions here and a very strict jurisprudence. And again, I want to point this out for the audience. A lot of us are very aware that our current judges, they're getting away with legislating from the bench, things like this. And what this is doing is cutting that out by having such strict jurisprudence that they are not going to be able to get away with that.
Right. And here's one of the things in the law is how it must be constructed. Right now, you can write a lot of nonsense and leave it open to interpretation. You can't do that anymore under propertarian law. It's an example that made me furious today. Some woman's in court. I saw it in the news. Someone's be taken to court because she and her husband were hanging up plasterboard, and she's walking around in her brassiere, and he's walking around with no shirt on because of all the dust, right? Well, the kids come in, and she's the stepmom. So what does the mom do? The mom accuses her of child abuse. And, you know, this is like this is actually in court. Now, of course, under propertism, you'd have, in order to say, you'd have to write it down exactly what it was in the whereas. So like now you say you can make a law about anything, but in propertarianism, it's like an algorithm. Whereas A, B, C, and D, now given A, B, C, and D, whereas E, F, G, H, and I, therefore we wish to, and such. And so you have to fill out all these pieces. And when you do that, you have to make it operationally testable statements. So it's not really possible to expand the law without making a concrete argument from reciprocity forward of why that's possible.
So you don't have all these wishy-washy, squishy definitions of things. Somebody can't just say, well, that's child abuse and kind of make up their own definition of child abuse or interpretation. Right. Everything has to be very strictly constructed, so you can't get away with that kind of thing.
Right. And even if you were to, like we have misnaming of laws all the time in order to create a false impression among people. Like even if you misnamed the law, you could be punished for it.
Wow, that's great.
And so the next thing is you have to sign the law.
You have to sign the law, you said?
Right, and you're liable for it.
You personally have to sign the law if you make a law of any kind, you're saying? As a person with power?
And you're liable for it.
And would this apply to judges as well, personally?
It applies to everybody.
Anybody that does that is liable for what they do.
Judges, anyone.
That's awesome.
You have personal liability for your judgments. Not just judges, politicians.
That's great.
So you're liable. So there's none of this stuff with let's pass it and get away. Let's pass it and leave it up to everybody else to figure out.
Everybody has skin in the game.
Yep.
That's fantastic.
So, honestly, the rest of it is stuff it's how does the court operate, right? How does this, what is the state? What are there are only four things to a state in the federal government, which is the state, which means the corporation and its assets, the military, the regiments, and the militia. And yes, it's remilitarizing the society. If you want to know why we're going to remilitarize society, just ask why all the men are unhappy. I'll explain it to you. It puts the treasury in place.
All right. So then after this is when we started talking about the policies. Let's go right to Curt here, talking about the goals of the Constitution and a couple of the ways it differs from the original Constitution. As you'll see, part of this is also restoring things to the way the original Constitution had it because it's been messed up since then. So let's get right into it.
So I want to go into the major differences because if we do that, we can sort of get people to top level.
The differences between the first American Constitution and this Constitution you're talking about, right? Yes, I think that's a good idea.
So first is everybody thinks about the Constitution in historical context. Everybody thinks about most of the world in post-war context.
Post-World War II, yes.
Right. We have a lot of agitation in the public about the current context, and very few of us have an understanding of the near future and long-term future context.
Mm.
Now, last time you and I talked about the future context.
Yes.
Right?
Yep.
And so the first thing is what I've proposed includes addressing the future grand strategy. In other words, I've tried to address the future as well as the present.
Okay, that makes sense.
All right. And so some of the things that say, why did you do that? It's going to be because of those reasons. Because I understand the what's happening demographically in the world, what's happening economically in the world, what's happening politically and strategic politically in the world.
Yes.
And these things are going to present a very different 21st, 22nd century than we have anticipated in the past or that we even fantasized would happen. And it's not a very good one, honestly.
So it's not just we're going to solve the problem that we have now and set ourselves up for the next few years. You have a long-term context in mind here.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to say, it's one thing to be the United States, but we have to think about a world in which we're not any longer the only world power, and that there are multiple bodies of people with competing interests with billions, not millions of people.
Yes. And how do we set ourselves up as America, as Westerners, not just to benefit ourselves, but how do we help influence the rest of the world because we're in such a position of strength and power?
And moreover, how do we make our revolution cascade to Canada, Australia, the UK, and the continent?
Yes, absolutely.
Right? So when I'm talking, that's the strategy I'm working under. It's not only the American continent and our problem, it's Western civilization in general.
Awesome. I know there's a lot of people in the rest of the English-speaking world, we'll put it that way, that are going to love to hear that, Curt.
Well, I got a lot of pressure from them, from the rest of it. I mean, frankly, from everywhere except France, I think, to say, well, what about us?
Yes.
Because we have more rights, we have preserved more rights of Anglo-Saxons until the present moment. It's easier for us to make a correction than it is for the rest of the people of the world.
Yes.
So it's kind of up to us, we happy few, so to speak, to quote the Shakespeare the Bard, it's up to us, we happy few, to save Western civilization from a second dark age.
Yes. So that makes sense. So that's the first improvement or change in the Constitution you're talking about there is...
some of the ideas, the policies, not necessarily the Constitution, but some of the policies are geared toward the expansion of this strategy of restoring Western civilization, not just to America, but for the rest of the world.
Makes sense.
All right? So I want to get that out. The second is our original Constitution was an experiment in governing under the common law, and this Constitution repairs those weaknesses that they didn't see. The common law, if people don't understand this, is I went back, I hit it already once, but it's the American, British, Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, Indo-European common law. I mean, the Greeks started with the same thing and Romans started with the same thing, but they evolved under their own circumstances.
It's like our historical law, Curt?
It's the historical traditional law of Western peoples.
Okay.
Right. And so the continental law, what they practiced was really Napoleon's imposition on Europe.
Okay. In Europe, you're talking about continental Europe. Okay.
Okay, and so the difference is, under the common law, we're all the same. Every person's the same, and when somebody works in government, it's just one of us who's taken on that responsibility.
Uh-huh.
In the continental law, there's definitely political class and servant class.
Okay, that makes sense. And then how does what you have here in the Constitution differ from that?
I'm just saying that it continues the common law tradition.
It. Okay.
Right?
Makes sense.
And that's mostly important because I want our European people, the people in Europe that follow us, to understand that that's a non-trivial difference in the fact that Anglo common law creates less regulation but more litigation, where the continental law creates more regulation and less litigation.
That makes sense. So continental law tries to shut more things down up front to reduce risk, which means you have less innovation, but less lawsuits on the back end. And then the reverse is true in the common law. Right.
All right. So it repairs some of that. And we tend to obsess over government, but really it's kind of, when I started figuring this out, it annoyed me. We obsess over government. You people talk about how government should be this or that or whatever thing, but the real answer is that this Constitution obsesses on law and rule of law, not on government.
And that's really the key. For the audience, do not miss that point. The key problem is law. The key problem to be solved, I guess you could say, not the form of government. And there are recommendations or different ways you can set up your government, from what I understand, Curt, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. But the law has to be right. It has to be natural law. So I didn't mean to cut you off, but I don't want the audience to miss that. That's a huge, important point.
It is important because if you get the law right, it actually doesn't freaking matter much about your government. That makes sense?
Yes.
So the more government you have, the more deliberation you have over right and wrong and this kind of thing, rather than what do we spend it on and how much have we got, right? It's actually a failure of law. If you read the average European Constitution, it's a comic book. It's hysterical. They're not constitutions. They're articles of faith.
So it doesn't. You're saying it doesn't have a good foundation of law. It's just people writing stuff down that they want.
Ambitions.
Interesting. And so, and again, this is such an important point. The situation we have in America where we're just, for example, we have our two political parties and we're just at each other's throats and we're desperately afraid of losing the next election because they're going to shove stuff down our throats that we don't want and all this. This whole situation is absurd. And a lot of people kind of intuitively get that. But what Curt is talking about here, when you get your rule of law right, it eliminates that whole thing. Yes.
You don't have to defend you. It depoliticizes the because the government is stuck now with trade. In other words, this class, I mean, most of the time, the upper class wants the lower class to behave.
Yes.
They'll give them anything if they'll just behave.
Just behave.
That's it.
Yeah.
The middle class wants them to behave enough that commerce can happen.
Yes.
But really, it's like the argument the conservatives have been making. I'll tell you what, trade us this for getting rid of the Department of Education. And then we'll give you your social whatever. But they don't want to make the trade.
Yes. So it's trades instead of fighting over trying to shove stuff down each other's throats. If you keep everything within the bounds of reciprocity with your rule of law, then the people or the representatives of the people are trading with each other, negotiating with each other instead of throwing punches at each other all the time.
Right.
Powerful.
I mean, all right. So we obsess over it, but this obsesses over law. And when John and I get to this part, I don't know if we'll cover it all today, but it's really the government. Once you have that law, the rest of the government is really a Chinese menu. Really, I mean, I really positioned it like that, especially not so much at the federal level because it has to be a certain the federal government has to remain a very simple thing, but at the state level, you just sort of pick your Chinese menu of how you want to govern, and it really doesn't matter because as long as it's within the law, it doesn't, you can have a more left-wing government, a more right-wing government, whatever you want at the local level.
And when you, just to clarify for the audience, when you say more left-wing or more right-wing, you mean with a little bit more redistribution to people who are more needy, or you can have less redistribution. You can kind of choose. The thing is it's not shoved down people's throats through just, we get enough votes, or there's not all this stuff going on outside of reciprocity. That's right.
States, a lot of small states create a market for norms.
Yes.
And so we're already conducting the Big Sort. You can read The Big Sort. It's a good book. We're already sorting.
Left-wing people moving to places where more left-wing people live, and right-wing people doing the same to where more right people live. Right.
And it's, that's fine, except that the left people want to impose their way, which is suicidal, but that's what they prefer. And the right-wing people want to suppress the left's urge to consume.
Yes.
And so the reason is because if you don't have kids and you're consumption oriented, your use of the commons is very different than if you have 5 or 6 kids. And so you need to be able to have high return commons with low individual consumption of them when you build families. And does that make sense?
Yes, that's a very powerful point that you had pointed out in your notes, and that you say very explicitly in this document as well, in the Constitution, is that the purpose of policy, or the focus of policy, is the intergenerational family, not just the individual can do whatever they want, no matter what costs it imposes on a family.
Right. So we have to. We can have the choice of to want to oppress each other, or in the way I've structured this, we have various ways of separating so that we can go our own ways, but we still have the value of the continental government. And the reason for that is because same reason the founders wanted is that once you allow an alien or a foreign power on the continent, we have an issue. So you have to maintain the federal government for military, trade, and insure a last resort, meaning disasters, etc.
Just those functions, nothing else, if I remember reading in the Constitution.
Military, treasury, insure a last resort, and then you have the Senate, basically, which functions as a market between the states. And that's really where you are. I mean,
yes. So just to be clear for the audience, a lot of the power in this, if I'm reading the Constitution correctly here, a lot of the power and the norms and all of that is just at the state level, as it really should be. More local, different strokes for different folks in many ways. And then there's this kind of limited federal government that operates the military and the treasury and a couple of necessary things where it's beneficial to have it there.
Yeah, it's almost purely depoliticized.
Yes. So we don't have these huge political fights.
Phenomenon.
Yeah. Yep.
Because that's where you want it. I mean, you want to have people with common interests, because that's what democracy is good for. It's good for selecting priorities among people with common interests. It's actually horrible for selecting choices among people with uncommon interests.
Yes. Because
the majority wins, and the other people get pissed. Which is what you see happening.
And that's what we're having right now. So just to pause here and let the audience just imagine how nice it would be to not have this huge political stress all the time, because the structure of the law is so good, and because just the structure of how things are organized as far as who has power where, a lot of the power devolved to the states, would make it just so much more peaceful, and we don't have so much of this political stress.
Yep.
That's great. So, Curt, any other ones that you want to touch on there?
I want to cover 4 of them.
Okay.
Right? The first is that I'm trying to address the primary problem of the 20th century, and most of my work is focused on this one issue, which is the ability to criminalize disinformation, misinformation, and manipulation. In other words, just like John and I just talked about depoliticizing, I want to de-disinformationize the informational commons. So whereas the 20th century honestly was large, I mean, I talk about Hayek predicting this and everybody else predicting this in the pre-war period, but the 20th century there is as much or more pseudoscience, lies, sophism, and economic and financial. It's numerously technically, but it's technically a sort of pseudoscience. There's as much of that as there is technical innovation. Because if you understand the 20th, we had a lot of technological innovation, but the science was actually all discovered in the 19th.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we have had a huge increase in tech. We've actually not had a very huge increase in science. So that's not true in every field. Obviously, in the biological science, particularly medicine, and in now genetics and cognitive science, we've had huge. But if you look at the progress of the social sciences, the economic sciences, political sciences, and the psychological sciences, it's been a joke.
It kind of like the human realm is kind of what I would call it with a general term. In the human realm, we haven't had science. We've had we've had some science, but a lot of it is suppressed. But we've had a ton of pseudoscience.
Furtherance. The purpose of that lie was to continue the great lies.
Yes.
The lies of Bose, Marx, Freud, that we're equal. And that now underneath this is one of the primary differences I didn't get to, which is that the enemy's strategy is to create discord so it can enforce a monopoly. Does that make sense?
Yes, because it wants to force its will on everybody else through the stress.
Authority.
Yes.
In other words, the reason they create this conflict is generate demand for authority, which they will provide. Whereas Western civilization, we are trying to do the opposite. We're trying to create harmony so that people can bubble up into a constantly rotating aristocracy.
Meritocracy, so the best people can do their thing and have a chance.
Right, because we've always been the small people on the edge of civilization, right? And so we need excellence to come up, and that's how one of the reasons we've been so successful is we create markets between the classes. And under Greece, under Rome, and even under the medieval period, you could get your way, you could escalate your condition if you were able to demonstrate it. Yes.
And our enemies want to do the opposite.
Exactly.
Yes.
They want to create discord so they can impose a monopoly, as if has worked so fantastically in the Middle East where all this stuff comes from.
Right. It's disastrous.
In the world's biggest shithole, with the world's least pleasant people, right? Who caused the world the most suffering, who caused the world the most damage in human history, who've destroyed the 5 great civilizations of the ancient world and trying to destroy ours in India. And thankfully, China's trying to resist them. And we wonder why that the way they work should work here.
So this is a lot of your intent here is to stop this then.
It's really to put us back on our traditional trajectory that's dragged humankind, including ourselves, out of ignorance, poverty, starvation, hard labor, suffering, child mortality, and early death, and a nature and the being victims of nature that tries to exterminate us about every 50,000 years.
Yes, absolutely.
So the second is to restore it to its original intent, right, which is to put this structure of restore the European Federation of small states, where we have the maximum competition between states and the maximum number of markets for people with differences, and so that we are always optimally calculating every possibility.
Instead of a huge federal bureaucracy just kind of controlling everything like an octopus.
Well, monopolies are bad.
Yes.
The only value of size is war.
Mm-hmm.
So the third is controversial, which is the failure of the integration, the failure of multiculturalism. I mean, it's fairly well known in the educational literature that integration has failed. Everywhere they've tried it, it's failed.
Yes.
It's pretty well documented now that it's failed everywhere we've tried it, no matter what. Whenever groups with different interests come up against each other, it's proximity that creates hostility, because we have different sexual, social, economic, and political market values. And when we come into contact with each other, we come into conflict with each other.
Yes. So multiculturalism has failed, etc.
And the democracy simply makes it an open license for people to enter into political conflict with each other.
Yeah, so I think this is a problem the audience is going to be very, very well aware of. And so one of your goals is to fix that problem?
Correct. And the fourth, it's a set of restitutions to compensate for that crime.
Okay. So some restitutions that restore our way of doing things, restoring how we've gone backwards.
Right. And they escalate in face of resistance.
Okay. So the more resistance we get, the more punishment is doled out to them.
Right.
Okay. That makes sense.
So basically there should be something to offend everyone.
Well, I tell you, Curt, I read it and I love it. So,
somebody made my day today. I feel bad. I can't remember his name, but I've had a bad week for a bunch of reasons, because the chipmunks are annoying me, so to speak. And he said, well, you don't have to worry, because there's millions of people out there who want this, and they're the only ones that matter.
Yes, that's right. The ones that want this actually, if you do the analysis, have the most ability to project power at the end of the day.
So something to offend everyone, including naming the enemy and the enemies and explaining their strategy. And
yes,
I'm not gentle about it. It's a prosecution like you'd hear in court. It's not kind.
That's great, Curt. And then in your notes, you also mentioned, I don't know if you want to talk about the primary audience for this. I know you mentioned the military is definitely going to be part of the audience for this.
The audience. Oh, I think I cut that out of this. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's completely fine. But it really touches on what we were just saying, that the people that matter are the audience for this.
The people who matter are the audience. Yeah, let's flip it around and say, I'm going to be my usual arrogant self that people appreciate so much. And that's that, guys, I work very hard. I know a lot of stuff. And honestly, if you disagree with something here, you need to ask me why, not just presume I'm wrong. There's very low chance I'm wrong.
Yes, and I would agree with that, is if you're reading something or hearing something and you don't quite understand it,
ask. I don't mind asking.
Just ask. Yeah, just ask.
So let's give people some context. They want a constitution, right? But what does that mean? I mean, in historical terms, the English Constitution was never written down. The British Constitution still isn't. Our ancestors wrote it down, but when they wrote it down, they were working with everything from the English Revolution, right? The Magna Carta, the relatively recent English. Remember, the Puritans are coming because of the English Revolution into America, and they're working from Hobbes and Locke and Smith and Hume, and they're trying to culminate the vast advancement in understanding that they have into a form of government that will function. Now, we've had a couple of hundred years of technological innovation beyond them, and we've been able to see that. So I get a lot of, I want something simple I can understand. And do you think you understand the Constitution as it's written? Because I'll bet I can ask you a couple of questions and you'll say that you intuit that what's moral about it. But whether you understand it or not is actually pretty hard to come by, because there's been a lot of abuse to it over time. So I want to put in context that just like when you had the Greeks ran into the problem of scale, in other words, they had practiced a traditional civilization. And as they grew and expanded into an empire, they ran into the problem of having to create this thing called philosophy so they could understand, frankly, what they were doing. And they could modernize. They could articulate what they were doing. Well, we had a similar problem in the Enlightenment, the scientific Enlightenment, and that was that the British Empirical Revolution came along, and those people were trying to preserve our way of life, just like you and I are trying to preserve our way of life. And that way of life is very old. I mean, it's not. We think of it as the American Constitution. Before that, the English Constitution. Before that, the right of the Anglo-Saxons. Before that, the customary law of the Germanic people, and before that, the customary law of the Indo-European people. So our traditional law is unique in the world, and it's incredibly old. So we have to go through this recycle every once in a while, because we get to the point where we've grown enough and enough's changed that we have to update that. And so we've been through generations of it. I don't know what generation I would call what we're doing today, but it's certainly it's certainly as big an innovation as it was for Jefferson and Adams. And they learned there was a lot that happened there that Jefferson and Adams tried to account for. That's why it's a pretty good constitution.
Yes.
Well, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so we're not plucking this out of thin air. You're not plucking this out of thin air. This is an improvement and an innovation, but it is one in a long line of stages, I guess you could say, of our civilization and our law. Right.
And, one of the problems is that neither the Aristotelians nor the British, nor the Americans, they got to the point where they understood natural law, but they didn't get to the point where they could produce a formal logic of law. And that's really the problem. In other words, they were never to make law into a science.
And that's what I see from your work, and that so many others see from your work, is it kind of takes what we as Western peoples intuit, as you say, it's like an intuition to us. And when I read, for example, the definition of reciprocity that you've written down, or the falsehood tests, and your writings, I realize this is kind of what I intuit. This is what us grassroots right-wingers, particularly Western peoples, we intuit this. And when I see it written down the way you write it down, I say, this is it. He's describing it in words. And so it is an innovation in that respect.
And so I think that's actually that's the part I actually have a romantic attachment to, is that I set out to create a value-neutral language. That's all I wanted to do, is I wanted to create a value-neutral language of ethics and politics that Western people could use, conservatives and libertarians, to explain our traditional way of life in rational and scientific terms, because honestly, it didn't exist. And what happened in the 20th century is it got intentionally, deceitfully mangled so that that underlying truth was obscured from us. And so what I've tried to do is put that into a form that isn't possible to screw with any more than the Pythagorean theorem is possible to mess with anymore. It's a very strict model, and I know it's hard for people to imagine that's possible, but while I love getting into the technical weeds, it horrifies or makes us lose people, so I'm going to avoid it. I'm just going to ask people to understand that it's not that I can't or don't know those technical weeds as well as any other logician on the planet. I do. I just find that nobody else cares as much as
We're going to try to keep this accessible, is what we're saying.
So I like to use quantum theory as a great example, is that if you want to hear a little bit about quantum theory, they use a lot of magic-y terms around for what is actually a pretty simple thing for very silly reasons. But you can explain it. But if you try to get into the actual construction of the wave formulas underneath it, it's pretty tedious. Well, the same thing in propertarianism. You don't have to understand how to do that formal logic in order to understand the outcome of it, any more than you need to understand quantum mechanics in order to understand why your iPhone works. You just don't need to know that. It's not necessary. But what I do think people need to know is that it's actually under there.
Yes.
Everything is built on it, and that's why everything's so detailed, is because it's sort of like mathematics. It's actually algorithmic instead of, like mathematics is. It's more like programming, but it's pretty rigid underneath there. Go ahead.
I was just going to jump in, Curt, and say that's a very important point, because a lot of what people will relate to, and you and I have talked about this, a lot of what people will relate to is the policies. They'll see a policy written in the Constitution and they'll say, oh, I get that. I see how that affects my life. But it's important to understand that underlying all of that as a very, very solid, detailed foundation is what is essentially science. It's applying science to the social and political realm. That's the foundation of it.
Yeah. When we say science, we generally mean consistent and correspondent with reality. And when we say logical, we generally mean sets. When we say operational, it means one step follows another. So just like you have sets and arithmetic and mathematics, and you have statistical correlation, in between there is a thing we call operations. And that's what propertarianism is based on. It's an operational logic. In other words, this, follows this, and you can test every step in it. I don't want to go any deeper than this, but we just want to make people understand that if I say it in here, I've written what's equivalent of an operational proof of it, that it's reciprocal.
Yes, and we could call this scientific rule of law or scientific government. Is that fair, Curt?
Correct. I mean, as long as we understand that scientific in our current sense is not scientific in the old sense. It's more rigid. It means not just rational, not just empirical, but also operational.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes, you can follow it step by step, and it's like computer programming. If you have one step that's not in there, or that's missing, or that's wrong, the whole thing doesn't work.
That's how we know a law. That's how we know P-law or propertarian law is correct or not, or how testimony is correct or not. Because if you can't get from step A to step B, then it can't be true. Anyway,
yes.
We don't want to get people on. We don't want to. I mean, I love this part of it. I mean, it's the part I'm really proud of. It's what people will remember me for, but it's not what people care about.
But I think it's good. We've given the people a good foundation that this is not just us picking policies out of thin air, right? There's an underlying logic, to use kind of normal language to talk about it. There's an underlying science to it, and that's very, very important. And that's why you'll see at the beginning of the Constitution, if you start reading it, there's a lot of definitions. There's a lot of detail put in there to make sure that the foundation is solid.
Right. Okay, so I'll get to that actual issue in a minute. So the reason I said that, look what all they did, all the work the Greeks did, you don't see the work the Romans did, but they did quite a bit of work as well. It tends to mostly be how did they administer using law. That's really where, in other words, the Romans were engineers that applied ideas more so than theorists like the Greeks were. And so you see that there. So I want to make the point that then we get to the British Enlightenment, and there's a lot that goes on there. And so that goes through to the American Constitution. That's sort of the end of it. After that, you have the French and the German and whatever, and those are actually reactions against the Anglo constitutions because they don't like it. And this is the part we have to get over as Europeans is the world doesn't like what we do. So we like what we do because it works for us, but the rest of the world doesn't. Anyway, starting with Darwin, my work is probably the sort of tail end of the Darwinian revolution, if you want to think about it that way. And so there's a lot that's put in here. And so when I say there's a constitution, it's way more than that. So there's really 4 sections. What does it cover? It sort of covers what's the current problem, why are we in the condition we're in, how can we fix it, what benefits do we gain from fixing it, and what are the costs and consequences of fixing it, and frankly, what are the costs if we just go to civil war? And I've tried to answer all those questions, but it's written sort of like a prosecution. The first section is an indictment. It's a sort of overall explanation of the successes of the European people and why we're in this problem today. And for 80% of people, it's enough. That's what's going to put it in ordinary people's language to understand what's happened. Okay. Right. The second part is the law, and it's a very technical thing, and it's great for philosophers or libertarians are very skilled at law and economics, so libertarians will probably like it. The third part is the
Kurt, just to say, that's kind of what we were talking about before with the technical aspect of it and all of that, right? That second section. Okay, go ahead. And then the third section
is the prosecution of the crimes, and this is where it gets very unpleasant, right? Where I name the enemy, and some of the enemy is our own, some of the enemy is others, and I do a pretty brutal job of slaying sacred cows all around. I wish I didn't have to, but in order to solve the problem once and for all, we have to understand at least what the crimes are. And even if we want to forgive some of them in ourselves, we have to know that they're still crimes.
So this is a portion where it's politically incorrect, which a lot of the grassroots right wing says, well, I don't care about political correctness. But as you say, you slay some sacred cows and you don't really hold back, which is really what we need to do, because we don't want our descendants to go through this again. We want to fix this problem, and that's what's necessary.
I am absolutely, positively, brutally honest. Yeah. Right? It's brutal, and it's not soft stuff. I lay it out. What's the technique, how it's been done, why it works, etc.
Yeah, and it's also important to point out, it's not out of hate, hate is a word that our enemies abuse anyway, but it's not even out of ill will. It's just we can't allow this to happen to us.
Right. All people develop a strategy. The gypsies have a strategy, right? Their strategy is a sort of organized crime. That's not a pleasant conversation to have. And so, however, to get to that's the only way of explaining why we're in the situation we're in. You brought up an interesting example a minute ago, and that was that it's politically incorrect. But when you understand that the foundation of Western civilization is truth before face, regardless of cost, and that political correctness is an attack on our foundational system, the very secret of the Western civilization, which is they want us to give face before truth, regardless of cost. Yes. They're actually attacking the entire basis of Western civilization with political correctness.
Yes, and face before truth, just so people understand, face is you don't want to make people feel bad, or you want to gloss over so that it doesn't offend anybody, that type of thing. Whereas the secret of Western civilization is we're really the only civilization that ever developed. We just speak the truth regardless of how it makes someone feel, and that is such a huge competitive advantage, and that's why Curt's saying political correctness is actually trying to pull the rug out from underneath that entirely.
The system has been evolutionary. How do we create conflict between the classes with Marxism? How do we create it between the genders with feminism? And how do we create conflict between different identities, nonconformity? How do we destroy Western civilization by fomenting discord by the false promise that we're equal?
Yep. That's it.
When the success of Western civilization is that we've always been tripartist, that means that there are classes. So the false promise that we're equal and that there's oppression or hostility going on, when instead we are vastly unequal. and that with markets we can cooperate despite our vast differences and all improve together. And so this is the great, the myth of oppression rather than self-domestication is where this great lie starts, and the false promise that it can be otherwise.
And some people might be saying, well, why does all this need to be in a constitution? Well, it's because we are identifying our really ancient strategy as Western peoples. And Curt has done a better job of outlining that than anyone I've ever come across. And it's important to outline it because then you know which type of behaviors and practices are against our strategy and against what works well and against natural law, etc. And you know what strategies are in line with our historical strategy and that which works for us and works so well. So this is all very necessary to have some foundation like this in the Constitution.
Well, wait, I want to correct something there. I gave you 4 sections: the indictment, the law, the prosecution, crimes, the judgment, enforcement, but the 5th piece is the Constitution. So yes. This is sort of like the Federalist Papers, right? Right? So these 4 sections are equivalent to the Federalist Papers.
Yes.
Right? Or does that make sense?
Yes.
And so when I started out saying that there's a lot of stuff here, that's what I meant. Just like they had the empirical revolution in the British Enlightenment, we've had the operational revolution. It's just like they had the Federalist Papers and they had Hume, Smith, Locke, and what am I missing? Hobbes. We have, Darwin and Menger and Turing and Doolittle. And so there's a lot here. And so that's when I say, somebody, show me the Constitution. I want something simple. Well, I mean, the Constitution only appears simple because you got this little document in front of you, but you don't have the thousands of pages of argument that went along to be able to produce it by all the thought leaders that went into it.
Yes.
And so when I talk to people, I get kind of frustrated that, well, I understand the Constitution. I'll bet I can ask you 5 questions, so you don't. So
it's laying the foundation and then getting to it's a foundation for the Constitution itself.
Right. So basically it's laid out like a court case, right? So the indictment, the law, the prosecution, the crimes, the judgment and enforcement, and the Constitution. The Constitution is the remedy. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense.
All right. So it's written as a prosecution. That's why I said, I mean, we've forgotten to get this across to people, but I used to say it really often that P is really, it's prosecutorial. And what differs between what we normally consider Victorian niceties or Greek and Roman niceties or traditional medieval philosophical and theological niceties is that P isn't like that. It doesn't assume people are good-natured.
P being propertarianism, yes, it's prosecutorial. It's like going into court and saying, no, you're not allowed to do this, 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 and this.
Right, and so it's not this thing of what people want from me is they want some justificationary moralism like they've had in the past and they're used to without realizing that's the reason they couldn't make a case for conservatism and libertarianism and Western civilization against the left. They couldn't make it because everybody failed. I mean, look at Russell Kirk. He's a catastrophe. These guys write sentimental moralism. Well, it doesn't hold up unless you agree with it intuitively.
Yes.
The problem is not whether you agree with it. It's once you get into an opposition with somebody, how can you decide even though you disagree?
Yes, so it's taking the conservative instinct, we might call it, or the Western civilization instinct, the Western strategy, and taking it the next step beyond just, this feels right to me, and I intuitively want to do this, to now we have it in very specific and precise legal and scientific language, and that can hold up in court.
It can hold up in court, and it also means you can explain. I mean, some people won't like some of the things I help them explain, but you can explain. There's nothing in social science, there's nothing in psychology, sociology, ethics, politics, or group strategy you can't explain in strictly constructed P language. Now, it's non-trivial, like, as you know. I mean, we've got a dozen of us now that are quite good at it and are able to conduct research in it, but it's non-trivial. It's like learning any formal logic or programming method. It's complicated, but you can make those cases in it. And once that happens, then enough of these basic ideas will filter down to ordinary people that they'll say, well, these are the 10 most common arguments we run up against, and these are the most 10 common answers to those arguments. And propertarianism or testimonialism or whatever you want to call it, or natural law, which we could call it any three of those three things, it will provide people with those explanations.
And hopefully I've been able to get across to people in some of my videos some of the core aspects of it that to me are not really rocket science. The aspect of reciprocity, the definition of reciprocity, that you can intuitively get that when you read it and you say, okay, that makes sense. And so I think at least a good portion of the core of it, or some of the basics, are definitely understandable by the average person.
I think so. I don't expect things to work out the way they do. When I write a proof, that's the answer, right? So, it doesn't really matter what I think. It matters that this is just how it is, and whether we have nonsense in our heads about it or not, we need to do things that way, if we want to retain our civilization.
So that concludes this 4-part introduction to the Propertarian Constitution. Curt and I are going to have future videos where we're going through more aspects of this in more detail, and it's going to be absolutely fascinating. There is nothing else more important that you can spend your time on as a grassroots right-winger than this, because as I've said many times, we can talk about the problems all day long, but this provides a solution. Also, make sure you're subscribed to my channel, because I'm going to have a video coming out soon called How to Crush the Left Once and for All, where I'm going to talk about the 5 essential elements of a power structure. And I'm going to talk about how this Propertarian Constitution strengthens each one of those 5 elements so that we, the grassroots right wing, can build a power structure that is somewhere between extremely difficult and impossible for our enemies to break down. So don't miss it. Make sure you're subscribed. Till next time.